Hey everybody, so this video is intended to help you develop a thesis in preparation for your final paper for this class, which is going to be sort of a culmination of everything you've been working on in the Freedom on the Move assignments. Over on your right here, a little bit of a table of contents for this lecture. I'm going to make this quick. I expect most of you have done this before, going back many years, and I expect some of you haven't done this in a long time. I think writing a thesis-driven essay is one of the more painful things that we do in school generally, but especially in history classes. It doesn't necessarily need to be. It's the kind of thing that gets easier with practice, but it's hard to practice because usually, like in this class, you only have sort of 1 or 2 times in a semester to do it. So one of my goals with this assignment is to give you 2 tries, right? So you're going to hand in a first draft on Sunday, which is August 9th. And then I'm going to turn that right back around and get it back to you by Monday. With feedback, I'm going to be available all week. We have a pretty light week next week, so I'm going to be available to give you more feedback and work on it with you. That's one of my favorite things to do as a teacher, is to get to sit down with someone and talk about a paper, what works, what doesn't work. So please reach out to me if you have questions about it. You get 10% of your grade is going to be completely covered by just handing in that first draft on time. So I'm trying to sort of reduce levels of stress around this, because I know these kinds of papers can be pretty frustrating at times. Overall, though, my big goal for this assignment is that you just take some time to reflect on what you've been learning in the class, and particularly what you've been reading in the Freedom on the Move advertisements. You know, you all have been researchers this semester. You've uncovered 9 ads individually that probably nobody or very few other people have ever really read or thought about before. You might, in most cases, be the first person who's ever written about the ad that you chose, which is a really cool thing. And this is your chance to sort of make a claim about what you've learned, right? Make an argument. And we'll see how it goes. Okay, so let's jump into things. Like I said, first draft is due on Sunday, final draft due the following Friday, which is the last day of the semester, and I'll be available to help you out throughout the week. And again, I really like to do that, and I promise that I won't be mean, and it will be a positive experience, I hope. Let's see, 750 to 1,000 words. It's when you use 12-point font and it's double spaced, that's usually about 3 to 4 pages. There's no extra points for writing 4 pages instead of 3, right? I give the paper length because I know it makes things easier for people and it makes people more comfortable, but you know, I'm not too worried about that. Try to keep it at 4 though. I don't know that there's much need to go on and on and on. And you know, submit an 8-page paper. You definitely won't get a higher grade just for doing that. So try and be tight, try and be focused, try and really emphasize the evidence that you found, and do it in 750 to 1,000 words. You know, I'm generally pretty informal with paper formatting, but there are a few things that I think are important. One is a title. Paper titles show that you've focused on a single thing, right? That you have a specific idea that's all yours, and you need to name your paper based on that. Okay, so titles are important as a sort of practice in thinking about the work you've already done. Page numbers just make my life easier, and 12-point font, which is just sort of traditional for history paper and will also help you. 12-point font and double spaced. Those 2 things will help you gauge how your length is fitting in to my expectations. And you can also use the word count to do that. I think that's all those things that I wanted to go through. Okay. The big question that you're going to be trying to answer in this essay is, what do runaway ads reveal about the transformation of American slavery from the colonial period to the Civil War? Okay. There's not a single answer to that question, right? There are dozens and dozens and dozens of potential answers because the ads all show some different things. And each of you brings a distinct and unique perspective to the ads that you read, right? We've had people this semester who were really careful to notice when ads referenced racial identity in interesting ways, right? Some of the ads would describe an escaped person, for example, as an Indian, right? And some of you were very self-aware to say like, hey, wait a second, that's interesting. What does that mean about the relationship between race and slavery in this period? And then I don't see that word anymore later on. Some of you were very attentive to issues of gender. Some of you were very attentive to issues of color or certain tone in language, those kinds of things. Follow your interests, right? And that will lead you to an answer to this question that's kind of all your own. The trick here, more than anything else, is to answer the question with your analysis of primary sources, okay? Here's what I'm not looking for you to do. I'm not looking for you to go back and watch all my lectures and repeat whatever analysis I've had in those lectures back to me, right? I'm not looking for you to regurgitate what I've said in the lectures and say, and think, okay, that's the right answer because Pat said it. That's not thinking, that's not critical, that's not interesting. Don't do that, okay? The trick here is, what have you thought about as you read these ads? What have you noticed? Why is that important? What does that tell us about slavery? Okay. There is a role for my lectures. I'll get to that in just a second. Okay. So really, more than anything, focus on your reading of the ads. Okay. So now what I want to do for the next few minutes is kind of run through some steps that you can follow as you begin putting this paper together. And the first place you always start when you're writing a history paper, and I think this is similar in every other discipline, is with your evidence, right? You go back and you look at the sources that you have. So just a reminder of what you're working with. It's actually quite a bit, right? You've all found individually 9 Freedom on the Move sources. And you also have a substantial amount of feedback that I've given you on how you read those sources, right? You have suggestions for ways to read them in other ways. I've posed questions to you about some of your conclusions. That's all evidence. That's all good stuff for you to work with for your paper. And I'm working through the final Freedom on the Move papers right now, and I'll have them back in the next day or two. So you'll have more of my feedback there. You have as well 12 primary sources that we've already read and 8 more that we're going to read this week, as well as my 5 lectures. So you've got a ton of other stuff that gives you background and context, right? I don't want you to answer the big question about runaway ads by just focusing, say, on Frederick Douglass and my lecture about the middle period of slavery, right? Remember, the emphasis remains on freedom on the move. But what we do as historians is we use some evidence to inform how we read other evidence, right? You could say, well, I have this ad from the 1790s, and I also have some excerpts from the Constitution of the United States that was ratified at like 5 years before the ads came out. So how can I make sense? What does that tell me about my ads? You have a bunch of documents from the colonial period as well that can inform how you read those first 3 Freedom on the Move sources. You've got a bunch of material from the Civil War era that we're reading together as a class. You've got my lecture about the sectional crisis. Those things can help you just clarify what your primary sources mean. Okay, so use those strategically, but don't let them be the focus of the whole paper, if that makes sense. And if that doesn't make a ton of sense, let's have a conversation about it and we can clarify that, okay? One other source that I think people overlook sometimes is you have a lot of group discussions that are still up, and you can go back and look at them. Things that you've been talking about all semester, right? You also have discussion questions that your classmates have posted that are examples of analytical thinking, right? That's what the discussion questions are. They show you a way of thinking critically about sources. So go back and take a look at those for some inspiration. Okay. All right, so that's the reviewing your sources process, and that can take a little bit. That might take you a couple days, although you have a real head start because you've already begun doing this work as you wrote the first 3 papers for this class. So you're well on your way, but go back and review what you have. The second step is much more specific to your individual experience in the class, which is to identify problems or insights or issues that you want to write about. And again, this is really up to you how you want to approach this paper. You can consider a topic that's jumped out to you or been very interesting to you in discussions, maybe that's come up a few times. You can think about common themes that you're noticing in your sources. You can focus on what seems to have changed from an ad that was published in 1720 to an ad that was published in 1859, right? What is different about them and what explains that difference? Here are some suggestions of certain things that I've noticed in your papers and that I've been encouraging people to think about. Names, right? Naming practices. To what extent have those changed from the colonial period to the Civil War? Geography, gender, family, skill and work. This goes along with family, but marriage, I think, is a big theme I've seen coming through. Personality descriptions, right? How enslavers describe enslaved people. All of these sorts of things are within the ads, and you've all been reading against the grain to uncover them. So if you're particularly interested in 1 or 2 of these areas, focus on that, right? And then more than anything, remember, I think this is something that a lot of folks get stuck with or get a little hung up on, is it's not just your job to identify a change, right? But to analyze why the change or continuity occurred, right? So if you're trying to identify what changed and then why that happened, okay? That's what historians do. What is the thing that changed? Why did that happen? Or alternatively, what didn't change? Why did it not change? Right? And what does that tell us about the society that produced these sources? That's kind of how historians approach any big project like this. And then from there, now you're in the heart of the assignment, right? You craft a thesis that's based on the interests that you've selected. One thing to say before I jump into the thesis, go back and read the papers you've submitted and read my my feedback. I think what you'll find is that you probably tend to focus on the same thing from paper to paper, right? Many of us do this because we have an interest, something, maybe it's subconscious, maybe it's not. And we kind of continually come back to it. Try to see if you've been doing that and make that the focus of your paper. Okay, so crafting a thesis statement. I'm sure many of you have been working on this or started working on this when you were in the 8th grade or something like that. And you've done it intermittently ever since, or, you know, as long as you've been in college, for sure. But just to reiterate a few points, just so we're all on the same page, a thesis is not just a statement of what you're going to discuss in your paper. I think sometimes people think that, right? They think like, oh, it's my sort of declaration of intention. In this paper, I will discuss the fact that runaway ads show a change, right? That's not a thesis statement. Instead, it's an argument about the past. It explains why or how something did or did not change, why something happened, right? And that why or how is really, really important. Again, it's not just identifying that something happened, it's explaining how and why. That's what analysis is. And without a strong thesis, for one, it's gonna be brutal for me to read your paper because it's just gonna seem like a kind of an assortment of things that you found, but they're not gonna necessarily be related, and there's not gonna be anything interesting because your analytical thinking won't be present in the paper, right? So that's what I wanna see, is you putting yourself out there, trying to make an argument, trying to take a stab and defend it with some evidence. I think some helpful questions that I like to ask as I'm trying to develop a thesis, these are super basic questions. What actually happened? Why does it matter? And then this is the important question. How did it happen? And your thesis statement is your answer to how did it happen, right? So remember, you only have 9 sources, which is a lot, but if you're writing a book, you would probably have 900 or more, right? So you have limited sources, so you're not going to write like a perfectly comprehensive essay, and that's okay. What happened in your sources, right? Did you notice, for example, that marriage became more commonly referenced in the ads? Okay, that's a what happened. Marriage appears to have become more common. Why does it matter? Oh, there's many answers to that question, right? But one could be that enslaved people were increasingly born in the United States and not, or in colonial America, North America, and not in Africa or in the Caribbean, which means that their communities were increasingly stabilized, which means that family and marriage bonds were becoming more and more common. How did that happen? Then you can jump in. Then you can go from there. You can go to my lecture, or you can go to potentially an outside source if you want, and you can try to explain what it was that happened. And you're just continually going back to your ads to show these changes. Okay, your ads as the key evidence. One question I always like to ask, is my thesis too obvious? For example, if your thesis is that the runaway ads show that slavery was dehumanizing, that's too obvious. If your thesis is the runaway ads show that slavery was racist, that's too obvious. Okay, so keep going if that's where you start. And it's okay to start there, but I want you to dig a little deeper. Okay, and feel free to send me your thesis statement so I can offer some suggestions about how to dig a little deeper. In the end, you want your thesis to be specific, and you want it to be defensible with the evidence that you have, which is limited, so do your best, but make sure you can defend it to some extent with your evidence. And I might call you out in my feedback and say like, oh, I don't know that this piece of evidence is really doing this for you, but I'd rather do that than you say something that's really obvious or not, really come up with an argument at all, right? Okay. Sorry for this sort of insane looking smiley face down here. The next step is really simple, just to organize the evidence that you have into paragraphs that are all going to support that thesis, right? This is probably my favorite rule to remind people of in all of writing. Every paragraph in your paper should be there for a reason, and it should support that thesis. So stay on topic, just stay focused, make sure what you include is relevant to what you told me you were interested in at the beginning of the paper in your thesis statement, all right? Another one that's pretty straightforward, cite your evidence. Historians tend to prefer footnotes that are in Chicago style, and there's plenty of online sources that can show you how to do that. I don't really, I don't get too hung up on this. It's not so much of a concern of mine what style you put things in. If you are comfortable in another style from another discipline that is your major, for example, and you want to use that, that's probably just fine with me, but you have to include the publication title, the place of publication, and the date, right? Because a footnote or a citation isn't just a formality, right? It's a way to show where your knowledge comes from. And in history, it's a way to show what the context of the knowledge you're using is. And it matters a great deal if you find an ad that was from Massachusetts in 1750 or an ad that's from North Carolina in 1812. It's a huge difference. Those are different universes. So you have to include that information in the citation. And then just a couple last minute things never to forget. Limit your quotes. I feel like sometimes people are more concerned with the length of the paper than they are with the quality of it, and they include like a 3/4 of a page long quote, or they include their entire advertisement for this paper. Don't do that, right? I want to see your analysis of the evidence. I don't need you to replicate the evidence. That's really helpful for those first Freedom on the Move papers we've been doing. It's not going to be that helpful for this one. So limit other people's words. What I want to see is your words, your thinking on the page, and then we can really, we can have a dialogue about your work, but we can't do that if it's other people's words. And then super basic, last point, don't plagiarize, don't cheat, don't steal someone else's words. I'll find out. I always find out, and it's just a pain. And I don't want to end our class, which I've had a good time doing, on a negative note. So just do your best on this paper, submit what you can. Remember that you have 2 tries because you have a first draft, and there's absolutely no need to plagiarize anything. If you're stuck, if you're having problems, you can always reach out to me, but stay within the boundaries of fair use, okay, and put your words front and center. Okay, so again, ask me any question you have about this paper. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. I've read so many fascinating interpretations of these sources all semester, so I'm sure these papers are going to be really cool. And again, don't sweat this first draft too much. Just get it down on paper, get your thinking down, and then there's plenty of time for us to arrange it before the final draft. Okay, thanks everybody.